A boot kicked at a rusted iron door. Once. Twice. The lock gave with a snap of old metal, and the door swung inward into the dark. A man stepped through, dragging one leg, breathing hard. The wind off the sea slammed the door shut behind him. He stood there in the pitch black, one hand braced against cold stone. A flashlight clicked on. The beam crawled up a wall, found a spiral of iron stairs going up forever into the dark. He was old. 70 if he was a day. Gray hair, gray stubble, a war jacket gone thin at the elbows. His other hand gripped a walking cane. He took one breath. Then he started to climb. His name was Frank Mercer. And he had no idea what was waiting for him at the top of those stairs. What he found up there changed everything. Stay with me. Let me back up. Because to understand why an old wounded veteran was climbing the stairs of a condemned lighthouse alone, in the dark, in the wind, you have to know how he got there. Frank Mercer was 72 years old, and he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He'd been a soldier once. A long time ago. He'd come home from a war they don't talk about much anymore, with a piece of metal in his hip the doctors had decided was safer left where it was. It ached when the weather turned. Which, in the part of the country Frank lived in, was most of the year. He lived alone. He'd lived alone for a long time. His wife had passed 11 years ago, fast and quiet, the way the good ones go. Margaret. She'd been a schoolteacher. She'd been the one who got him out of bed in the mornings after the war, when the noise in his head was still loud, and she'd been the one who finally made it go quiet, just by being in the room. They had never had children. Doctors said it was the war. Frank had stopped asking which one of them carried the blame a long time ago. It hadn't mattered. Margaret had been enough. His brother had stopped speaking to him decades back over something Frank could no longer remember the shape of, only the cost. The army pension paid for the small rented apartment over a hardware store, and for the cans of soup he ate standing up at the counter, and for not much else. Some weeks he didn't speak to another human being from one Sunday to the next. Now here's the thing you need to understand about Frank. He was not bitter. People who don't know veterans like Frank assume bitterness, but bitterness takes energy he didn't have. He was just done. He had outlived everyone who'd ever known his name as a young man. He had outlived the country he thought he was fighting for. He got up every morning because the body kept getting up out of habit. And he kept going because he had given his word, a long time ago, to a girl in a white dress, that he would not be the kind of man who quit. So he got up. And he made coffee. And he took the bus to the cemetery once a week and put fresh carnations on a grave. And he came home. That was his life. Until the letter came. It was a Tuesday morning in November when Frank Mercer's life turned. He almost didn't open the envelope. It had the look of bad news, thick paper, a law firm's name in the corner. He set it on the counter beside the unwashed coffee cup and stared at it for almost an hour before he finally tore it open. It was a letter from a lawyer. A man Frank had never heard of. The lawyer was sorry to inform him that his uncle Cornelius Mercer had passed away 3 weeks ago. Frank stood there with the letter in his hand and frowned. Cornelius. He had to dig back 50 years to find that name. His father's older brother. The strange one. The one who'd lived alone on the coast in some old place nobody in the family ever talked about, except in the kind of voice grown-ups use when they don't want children to hear. Frank had met him exactly once. He'd been 8 years old. He remembered a tall thin man with kind eyes and a voice that sounded like the bottom of a barrel. He remembered being given a piece of hard candy. He remembered his mother taking him by the wrist and pulling him away from the porch where the tall man sat. He had asked, on the long ride home, what was wrong with Uncle Cornelius. His mother had said the only thing she ever said about him. That he was sick in the head. That good families had to make hard choices. That Frank was not to mention him again. So Frank hadn't. For 64 years. That was it. That was everything Frank knew about Cornelius Mercer. But Cornelius, the letter said, had left him something. The entire family had been notified. Cousins, nephews. None of them had wanted it. They had all signed it over, gladly, to the next name on the list. Which was Frank. The letter said Frank was now the legal owner of a property. A piece of land on a stretch of coast about 6 hours' drive from where Frank lived. And on that land was a structure. A lighthouse. Decommissioned in 1981. Condemned by the county in 1989. Sealed up and left to rot for almost 40 years. Frank read the letter 3 times. Then he sat down at the kitchen table and laughed. Because it was the kind of joke the universe pulls on a man at the end. Here was your inheritance, old soldier. A ruin. A pile of stones nobody else wanted. Welcome to the family. He almost threw the letter away. He almost called the lawyer and signed it back over to whoever wanted it. Frank Mercer had no business owning a lighthouse. He had no business driving 6 hours into the cold for anything. He was a man who lived in 3 rooms over a hardware store. That was the size his life had become. But there was a line in the letter that stopped him. The lawyer wrote that his uncle had specifically named Frank in his will. Not just as a backup. As the intended recipient. The lawyer had been instructed, in writing, decades earlier, to make sure that if no other Mercer accepted the property, it would go to Francis John Mercer, son of Daniel Mercer, late of Riverton. Frank Cornelius Mercer, who had not seen his great-nephew since the boy was 8 years old, had written Frank's name into a legal document and left him a lighthouse on purpose. Why? Frank sat with that question for 2 days. He sat with it on the bus. He sat with it on the bench beside Margaret's grave. He sat with it at 3 in the morning when his hip woke him up the way it always did. And he could not let it go. Because the truth was, in all the long years of his small quiet life, nobody had picked Frank for anything. Not one person. He had been the spare son, the quiet brother, the steady soldier nobody promoted, the husband who had outlived the woman who chose him. To be picked, even by a dead man, even for a ruin, was a new thing. And it would not let him sleep. On the 3rd morning, he made a decision he would not have made a year ago. Maybe not even a week ago. He packed a small old suitcase. He put on his army jacket. He took the bus to the depot, and he bought a one-way ticket to a town on the coast he had never heard of. He went to see what an old man he barely remembered had wanted him, of all people, to find. The bus ride took 9 hours, with 2 transfers. Frank slept maybe one of them. He watched the country go by through the smudged window. Hills that turned into low farmland. Farmland that turned into scrubby pines. Pines that finally opened up onto a long gray strip of road with the sea on one side and nothing on the other. By the time the bus dropped him at a crossroads at dusk, his hip was a single solid ache, and he had to stand for a full minute holding the bus rail before he trusted his leg to take his weight. The town was called Iron Cove. It was the kind of place where the diner closes at 7 and the gas station closes at 8 and there are more boarded-up storefronts than open ones. The kind of place the world had quietly moved past. A salt-stained sign at the edge of town said population 412. Somebody had crossed it out in black marker and written 287 underneath. Frank found a clerk at the only motel still taking customers, a woman in her 60s with a hard, kind face and silver hair pulled back tight. He told her his name and his business. She looked at him for a long time. "You're the one who got Cornelius's place," she said. "Not a question. That's me. You know what you're walking into, son?" Frank almost smiled at son. He hadn't been called that in 40 years. "A condemned lighthouse," he said. "That's what the letter says." She poured him a cup of coffee from a pot that had been sitting since lunch. "That place," she said, "has been sealed up since I was a young woman. Nobody goes out there. Nobody talks about it. Your uncle stopped coming into town in 81. Lived out there alone right up until last month, when the postman finally noticed nobody had picked up the mail in 2 weeks." She slid the coffee across. "There's stories about that lighthouse. About what your uncle was. About what's in it." "What kind of stories?" "The kind nobody can prove. But everyone repeats." She looked at him over the rim of her own cup. If you'll take my advice, sell the land and go back home. There's a developer over the county line already asking. He'd give you good money. You don't need to set foot inside. Did you know him? Cornelius? She hesitated. I knew him before. Back when he still came into town. He was a quiet man. Polite. Always tipped his hat to the ladies. I never believed half of what they said about him. Her face did something small and tight. But then he stopped coming in, and the stories got louder, and after a while there was nobody left to argue with them. That's how those things work in towns like this. Frank thanked her. He drank the coffee. He took the key to a small clean room over the motel office, and he slept the heavy sleep of an old man who has come a long way. And the next morning, he walked the 3 miles out to the headland alone. The lighthouse was worse than the photos. Stone tower, peeling white and red, 50 feet of rust and salt. The keeper's cottage at its base was caved in on one side. The windows were boarded with planks that had themselves started to rot. The whole structure stood at the edge of a cliff like it was already considering jumping. But it was his. He walked the perimeter once, slow, leaning on his cane. The grass was wild, the path overgrown, but he could see, here and there, the faint suggestion that somebody had once kept it. A line of stones around what had been a flower bed. A rusted rake leaning in a corner of the cottage wall. A pair of work gloves on a windowsill, gone hard as wood from the salt and the years. He looked at the lock on the iron door, an old padlock the size of his fist, eaten through with rust. He took the key the lawyer had sent him out of his pocket. The key didn't fit. He tried it twice. Then he stood back and looked at the door, and at the lock, and at himself, an old soldier in a rusted thing, and he almost laughed. So Frank Mercer did what soldiers do. He found a rusted iron bar in the grass, the kind that probably used to be part of a railing, and he wedged it into the lock, and he leaned his whole weight on it. The lock gave with a snap of old metal. The door swung inward into the dark. The wind off the sea slammed it shut behind him. He stood there in the pitch black, one hand braced against cold stone. A flashlight clicked on. The beam crawled up a wall, found a spiral of iron stairs going up forever into the dark. He took one breath. He started to climb. Now, climbing 147 iron steps with a metal hip and a cane is not a thing a man does quickly. Frank took it slow. He counted them as he went, the way he'd counted things in the war, to keep his mind on the next step instead of the long climb up. He passed 3 landings. He saw a small kitchen on one, a narrow bed on another. The remains of a life. A teacup on a saucer. A pair of reading glasses folded neatly on a table. A book left open by the bed, face down to hold the page. As if Cornelius had just stepped out for a moment, 40 years ago, and not come back. At the top, Frank pushed through a low wooden door. And he came out into the lantern room. And he stopped. He had braced himself for ruin. For broken glass and bird nests and 40 years of rot. For the kind of thing the woman at the motel had warned him about. That was not what he found. The lantern room was clean. Swept. Dusted. The wraparound glass was foggy with salt but unbroken. The old lamp itself was gone, but the iron stand it had sat on was polished. And around the room, on every flat surface, were boxes. Plain cardboard archive boxes, the kind a careful man uses when he wants something to last. Each one labeled in neat black ink. And in the center of the room, set on an old oak table where the lamp had once stood, was a single thick leather folder. On the front of it, in clean black ink, was Frank's full name. Francis John Mercer. Written by a man he had met for 10 minutes when he was 8 years old. For a long minute Frank just stood there. He had been preparing himself, on the long bus ride, for many things. A wreck. A hoarder's nest. Nothing at all. He had not been preparing for this. For the meticulous, lived-in order of a man who had been waiting. He sat down on a stool because his legs would not hold him. He set his cane against the table. He drew the folder toward him. His hands were shaking. He noticed that with a strange detachment. Frank Mercer's hands had not shaken since he'd put his rifle down for the last time in 1972. He opened it. And what he read in the first 3 pages was so quiet, and so devastating, that for the next 10 minutes Frank Mercer forgot how to breathe. Now, here's the part where I have to ask you something. If you've ever been the youngest one in a family that kept secrets, if you've ever felt, your whole life, like there was a room in the house you were never allowed into, then you already know what was waiting for Frank in that folder. And if you're still with me, take 1 second and hit that subscribe button, because what Frank read in his uncle's handwriting was only the beginning. The real shock was still coming. Inside the folder were birth certificates, letters, court documents, photographs of people Frank had never seen, and of people he had grown up with, taken from angles he had never seen. There was a long, slow, careful explanation, written in his Uncle Cornelius's neat hand, that began with the words, "Frank, if you are reading this, then I am dead, and the others have signed away their claim, and the truth has finally reached the right person. I am sorry it took this long. I tried." Frank had to stop reading. He had to put the folder down and stand at the dark glass and look out at the sea for a long time. Because what his uncle was telling him, in that folder, was that everything Frank had ever known about who he was, who his people were, and why they had thrown Cornelius away, was a lie. He went back to the table. He picked the folder back up. He kept reading. The wind hummed against the glass and the gulls cried over the cliff, and an old man in a lantern room learned, page by careful page, the truth. His Uncle Cornelius had not been the strange one. He had been the honest one. That was the whole story, told slowly and carefully, with documents to back up every line. 40 years ago, Frank's own father, a respected man, a churchgoer, a pillar of the small town Frank had grown up in, had been part of something. Not alone. Together with 2 of his brothers and a banker friend, Frank's father had quietly cheated their oldest brother out of an inheritance. A piece of seaside land, and the family savings tied up in it, that had been left to Cornelius by their grandfather. They had forged a signature. They had bribed a clerk at the county registry. They had told Cornelius the land was worthless and gotten him to sign papers he could not read clearly because his eyes had been ruined in a refinery accident the year before. They had taken everything. And when Cornelius had finally figured out what they had done, he had threatened to go to the law. So the family had done what families like that do. They had closed ranks. They had whispered to the neighbors that Cornelius was unwell, unstable, dangerous, even. They had told the children, including a young Frank, that Uncle Cornelius was not someone they spoke to anymore. And they had let Cornelius retreat to the one piece of land that he had bought himself, long before the theft. A condemned lighthouse on a cliff. A place nobody wanted. The only thing they could not take. And Cornelius had spent the next 40 years gathering proof. That was what the boxes were. 40 years of patient, careful work. Bank statements. Forged deeds with the originals next to them. Sworn affidavits from the bribed clerk's deathbed confession, witnessed and notarized. Letters Cornelius had written to his brothers and never sent. Photographs of the cars they had bought with the stolen money, the houses they had remodeled, the lives they had quietly inflated with what should have been his. A whole life's worth of quiet, methodical evidence, prepared with a soldier's patience, by a man the family had called crazy. And at the bottom of the folder, in a separate envelope, was the thing Cornelius had truly left Frank. A list of assets. Bank accounts in Cornelius's own name that had been collecting interest since the war. Stock certificates in 3 companies, bought cheap in the 70s, never sold. The original deeds to the seaside land, which the developer in the next town wanted so badly. And a sum of money that, by the time Frank had finished reading the figure twice, made his hands shake all over again. Cornelius had not been poor. He had been patient. He had lived like a poor man in a condemned tower for 40 years, and he had let everyone think he was a beaten old hermit, while he quietly held on to the truth, and to a fortune he had never spent a dime of. He had been waiting for the family that wronged him to die off, so he could give it all to the one Mercer he had decided was clean. He had picked Frank because of one afternoon. One afternoon, 50 years ago, when an 8-year-old Frank had quietly taken a piece of his own bread at a family lunch and walked it across a yard to a tall thin uncle who had been told to eat alone, on a porch, like a dog. Frank did not even remember it. Cornelius had remembered it for the rest of his life. "You were the only one of them," Cornelius had written, in the letter under Frank's name, "who treated me like a man. You were a child. And you understood something the grown men in our family never learned. Everything I have, I leave to you. Spend it. Do good with it. And do not let them tell you, when this gets out, that I was the strange one. I was the only one who told the truth." Frank closed the folder. He sat very still in the lantern room, with the gray light of morning starting to come up over the sea, and he cried in a way he had not cried since the day Margaret went into the ground. Not for the money. The money was a strange afterthought. He cried for an old man who had eaten alone on a porch and never been asked back to the table. He cried because the family Frank had spent his whole life feeling estranged from had not actually been his family at all. The good one, the honest one, the one who had been waiting for him, was the one they had taught him to forget. He came down from the lighthouse 3 hours later. Slow. One step at a time. When he reached the bottom and stepped out into the morning sun, the wind off the sea hit him in the face, and for the first time in a long time, Frank Mercer felt something move in his chest that was not pain. He walked the 3 miles back into Iron Cove. He went to the motel and woke the clerk and asked her, please, where the nearest honest lawyer was. Not the one his uncle had used. A new one. She looked at his face for a long moment, then she gave him a name. Her own niece, she said. Young, sharp, just out of law school, set up in an office over a bakery 2 towns down. By that afternoon, Frank was sitting in that office, sliding the folder across a desk, and watching a young lawyer's face change as she read. Now I have to tell you. What Frank did next, he did not do for himself. He did not sell the land. The developer offered him a great deal of money, more money than Frank had ever held in one place, and Frank quietly turned it down. He kept the lighthouse. He paid for the cleanup himself. He fixed the door. He sealed the cottage at its base, and he had the inside of it gutted and rebuilt as a small museum. A museum to a man named Cornelius Mercer. He paid to have a road put in, a proper one, so that anyone who wanted to visit could. He paid for a small wooden sign at the gate. And he paid, out of his own pocket, for a single new light bulb to go in the lantern room. Not a beacon, not anymore. Just a small steady light, on a timer, that came on every evening at dusk. Visible from the town on a clear night. A small thing. A quiet promise that somebody was still home. He took the case to the law. Most of the men who had wronged his uncle were dead. But their estates were not. Their children, the cousins who had signed the lighthouse over so quickly, were not. Frank Mercer, a tired old veteran who had not made a fuss about anything in 50 years, made a very large fuss about that. With the help of a young lawyer and a folder of evidence 40 years thick, he saw to it that the truth was put on a county record. That the names of the men who had thrown his uncle away were put down beside what they had done. That Cornelius Mercer was given back, on paper, the good name they had taken. He did not press for the money back from the cousins. They had children of their own, and Frank had decided he was not in the business of breaking other people's lives, even guilty ones. Instead he asked for one thing. A signed letter from each of them, acknowledging the truth of what their fathers had done. He kept those letters in a glass case inside the museum. Visitors could read them. That was the punishment Frank chose. Not money. Just the truth, in their own handwriting, where anyone could see. And then Frank did the thing he had not been able to do in a long time. He spent some of the money. He didn't keep much. He bought a small house in Iron Cove, in walking distance of the headland, where he could see the lighthouse from his kitchen window. He fixed his hip with a doctor he could finally afford. He sent quiet checks to a veteran's home 3 counties over, the kind of place he had almost ended up in himself, with one rule attached. That every man who walked through the door was to be treated like a man. Like he had a name. Like somebody had been waiting for him to come. And the rest of it, the bulk of what Cornelius had spent 4 years saving, Frank put into a foundation. A simple one, with a simple rule. It paid for legal help for old people who had been cheated out of inheritances by their own families. People nobody believed. People the relatives had called crazy. The foundation was called the Cornelius Mercer Fund. And the office on its letterhead listed the same address as the small museum at the base of the lighthouse. In the first year, the fund took on 11 cases. By the third year, it was 40. By the time Frank was gone, the foundation had recovered money or land for nearly 200 old people who had been written off by their families, and the museum at the base of the lighthouse had a guest book 3 inches thick. The first case the fund ever took on was a woman named Ruth. 81 years old, 3 counties over, a widow whose sons had quietly moved her into a one-room rental and sold the farm her husband had spent 50 years working. They told her it was for her own good. They told the neighbors she had gotten confused. They told her, the few times she pushed back, that she should be grateful they had not put her somewhere worse. The young lawyer Frank had hired drove out and took Ruth's statement at her kitchen table, and 6 months later, with the foundation paying every dollar of the costs, Ruth had her farm back. She wrote Frank a letter. He kept it in the same desk drawer as the one from Cornelius. He lived another 9 good years. In all those 9 years, Frank Mercer was almost never alone. The town adopted him in the slow, careful way old towns do. The motel clerk turned out to make a very fine pot of coffee, and a very fine companion across a small kitchen table. Her name was Eleanor. They never married. They didn't need to. They just kept each other company across that small table for almost a decade, 2 old people who had stopped expecting anything and had quietly been handed each other instead. The young lawyer came to see him every other Sunday with case updates and her 2 small children, who called Frank Grandpa Frank without ever being told to. He started painting again, something he had not done since before the war. Mostly the lighthouse. Mostly the sea. And every Sunday afternoon, until the day his hip gave out for good, Frank Mercer climbed the 147 iron steps up to the lantern room. He sat on the same stool. He looked out at the same sea. And he had a quiet conversation with an old man he had only met for 10 minutes when he was 8 years old. "I see you, Uncle," he would say. "I see you now." The day Frank died, he died peacefully, in his small house, with the lighthouse visible through the window. Eleanor was holding his hand. He was 81. They buried him on the headland, by his uncle's grave, with the lighthouse keeping watch over both of them. And on the small bronze plaque at the base of the tower, where the sign for the museum stands to this day, are the only words Frank ever asked to be carved anywhere with his name on them. For the ones who ate alone on the porch. "We see you. Come inside."